Our last session is From Progress to Pushback. How can business leaders stand firm on responsible business commitments? Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be moderating the closing panel of the conference today. And I'm actually going to ditch my introduction because I thought the film set the scene perfectly. And we are very short of time, and I'd really like to ensure that we have the maximum amount of time to hear from our amazing panel. So I'm going to dive right into some introductions. To my immediate left, we have Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, CEO of E.L. Rothschild and founder and co-chair of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. Next to her, we have Dr. Sally Uren, OBE, CEO of Forum for the Future. We have Zishan sitting next to Sally, Zishan Sohail, Social Impact Manager at Nestle. And to my far left, we have Dr. Nicoletta Pickle-Ravasi, founder of Applied Sustainability. So my main aim today, after the very interesting discussion that we've just heard on the previous panel, is to keep things as positive and practical as possible as we discuss what role business leaders have in really standing firm on their ESG commitments. And Lynn, I'd really love to come to you first. If you could perhaps inspire our audience with your vision for inclusive capitalism, and maybe tell us a little bit about the mood that you're seeing amongst business leaders.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you to organizers. I know you've put so much work into this, and I've done this conference before, and in a way, the fact that we have to have a conference on trust is a great lead-in to why we, I believe, need inclusive capitalism. Hopefully, what it means is in the term itself, that we have to have an economic system that works for all, that works for shareholders, that works for workers, that works for consumers, and exists in a society that trusts the system itself. Because capitalism is really, we are allowed to be capitalists because we are given a so-called license to operate by society. And we should not, and some people have said, well, inclusive capitalism is a complete oxymoron because there's nothing inclusive about capitalism. It doesn't work for me at all. And because that is true, we have got to reform what capitalism is. And that's what we try to do with inclusive capitalism. And the approach that I've taken, and my wake-up call was the financial crisis of 2009, when I didn't understand why all these young people were out demonstrating. Why weren't they getting jobs? And my children, who were then at university, said, Mom, there aren't jobs. It's not like when you entered the workforce. It doesn't work. And that was when I started taking a deep look at it. And look, today in the United States, the top 1% controls 35% of our national wealth. In the UK, the top 1% controls 23% of the national wealth. So it's no surprise that Britons say, only 20% of Britons say that the economic system works for them. And we cannot have a democracy that isn't based on trust and inclusion. And that means different things for different people. And I've been very fortunate to be able to work with several of the CEOs who were in that film who believe the same thing, but we actually need a movement. We need investors who demand that they understand what companies are doing with their workers and with the planet. And we need policies from all of our governments that rebalance the playing field. So that all the benefits do not go to the people with capital. We just have to accept it. It's not a left-wing proposition. It is a survival proposition, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I know that you were at the UK International Investment Summit last week. Can you tell us a little bit about the mood amongst business leaders currently?
Well, I wouldn't say inclusive capitalism was the top thing on their mind. the day after I spoke at the summit on giving an impact. And I wish that those two things would come together, because it is like Ken Chenault, the former CEO of American Express, said at the Democratic Convention. He said, we have to be pro-worker and pro-market. Now, at the investment summit, it was all about how business can make a great return. There wasn't too much about how we will take care of our workers. But we have to stop that dichotomy. There is not a dichotomy. Companies that take better care of their workers are more successful over the long term.
And that's a perfect segue. Sally, I'd really like to bring you in. I am intrigued as to why a leading sustainability development charity is putting business at the heart of its strategy alongside food and energy. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's sort of inspired that and why it's so important? And perhaps also, if you could tell us perhaps your view of how you think business leaders can push back against the accusations of woke capitalism?
Sure, thank you. And hello, everybody. Lovely to see you in the slight gloom of the audience, but it's very nice to be here. Why have we put business at the heart of our strategy? For the simple reason that the transformation that we need to see of our food system, our energy system, our global economy relies on all actors in that system working together, and the private sector is a really significant actor in that system. The private sector produces products and services that provide solutions to many of our challenges. They are a massive employer. They have supply chains that crisscross the globe, reach hundreds and thousands of communities. They have brands that influence the behavior of billions of people. They also have access to capital. So the private sector, in many ways, has got a disproportionately potential positive role to play in this transformation. And in the work that we're doing at Forum, we're really trying to unlock the role of the private sector in the renewable energy transition, along the lines of a just transition, in the transition of the food and ag system towards regenerative ag. And then we're looking at specific issues such as the intersection of climate and health. How do we unlock the private sector to drive co-benefits on climate and health? So that's kind of the why. We just see that the private sector has got this incredible role to play, and broadening out the purpose of business automatically broadens out the purpose of the economy. If the purpose of business is not just to deliver a shareholder return, but is also to deliver positive impacts for people and for the planet, then the goals of the economy begin to shift. So that's another kind of underpinning. So the second part to your question is advice for how to stay firm in the kind of heady winds of anti-ESG, anti-woke sentiment. And I've got a 5-point plan, if that's okay. So the first is to really focus on the context. And this picks up some of the points in the previous panel session. We have got at least 3 reasons to feel optimistic. So the first is that it's almost impossible now to borrow capital from banks without a climate assessment plan. The cost of renewable energy, fun fact, here in the UK is from renewable energy from wind and from solar is 99.9% cheaper than it was 15 years ago. So market economics are going to make sure that that transition happens. And there are also the fact that the anti-ESG brigade is incredibly well funded and really good. So another fun fact, for every anti-ESG shareholder resolution in the US right now, there are 10 pro-ESG shareholder resolutions. But we only hear about the anti-resolutions because this is a movement that's very well funded and very, very strategic. So in some ways, the facts, the data would suggest it's maybe not as bad as leaders would, it feels. But then moving on to sort of my second point is, I think it's really important to reframe the narrative. And particularly in the US right now, terms like climate justice, you can't even say ESG, which is probably not a bad thing, but that's another subject around ESG. But reframing climate justice as access to long-term employment, safety for your family, means that you can actually take the partisan element out of the rhetoric. So that would be my sort of second point is, where are the opportunities to use different language and just take the politics out of the conversation? And then I think the third thing we need to do is also linked with reframing the language, is reframing the narrative, is to focus on the language. And the language of business of shareholders is very much about risk and resilience. And those two phrases actually, again, allow you to sort of step over the partisan nature of the debate. And a supply chain that is decarbonised, that has got climate adaptation built into it, is a resilient supply chain, which makes complete business sense. Number 4, and it was kind of highlighted in the film, is whilst these headwinds can feel quite torrid and very politicised, employees really care about this agenda. And so if you're a CEO wondering, how to kind of stay true to the bold ambition of your sustainability plan, how can you harness your employees? There are lots of data points that suggest that where organisations have rolled back on commitments, and there are a few at the moment, employees actually are citing this as a reason for maybe leaving. And so really kind of tune into that employer sentiment. We've just heard the stats about how, a cohort, Gen Z, millennials care about this agenda. And then the 5th thing I wanted to say, and this might be a little bit more controversial, it's okay to recalibrate. When many organizations set their ambitious net zero targets in particular, maybe 6-7 years ago, we honestly didn't have a roadmap for decarbonisation of supply chains. We've now got that roadmap. We now understand how to delineate between scopes 1, 2, and 3. And actually, it's okay to recalibrate your implementation plan based upon what you're learning, as long as you're focused on the material impacts that your business have. I think there's a sort of reluctance to be more honest about how hard some of this stuff is, but actually, I think business leaders could afford to be more honest with data points as to how they are making a difference. So that recalibration, I don't think, is the disaster that perhaps it might seem.
Thank you so much, Sally, and brownie point for keeping it practical. Thank you very much. We love a 5-point plan. Zishan, I'd really love to come to you. Thank you so much for joining us from Nestle today. This must be a really pertinent issue for Nestle. I know you've got a brand new CEO, you've just released your 9-month results that are showing lagging growth, and I'm just really interested in the insight that you might be able to give us all about what the mood is internally, and perhaps the changing shape of leadership in this context.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks, Katie, and thank you to Thomson Reuters Foundation for the invitation, for putting this together. It's great to be here with you all. Allow me to take you back 2 decades. It's about 2005, 2006, and this philosophy of creating shared value had just begun taking sort of shape at Nestle. We were the only company to go out on a limb and say that not only should we be making money, but society should be benefiting as well. And you fast forward a couple of years and you realize, oh, everyone's following suit. There's this coalition of the willing that's forming. People are looking at it from a stakeholder capitalism versus a shareholder capitalism perspective, very much in line with what Lynn was talking about. Fast forward now 20 years, you're talking about these results. The results were announced last week. Yes, not so great. But concurrent, almost simultaneously, there was a restructuring, a mild sort of a restructuring that was announced. That didn't get a lot of pickup in the media. But interestingly, our focal point for sustainability, who used to report to the chief operating officer, now directly reports to the CEO. And it's kind of interesting to see how that news was not picked up, but instead people focus on, the results are lagging, what's going on? Well, I mean, if I put two and two together, I would think maybe the sustainability issues, if we can solve them, can also solve the financial problems. And I think that's very much the sort of Nestle ethos and the Nestle way of approaching these sorts of problems. And so, I mean, I would just like to echo what Lynn and Sally have been saying. It almost seems like they've been working at Nestle because the philosophy and the values are so similar in terms of what the way we approach the situation and the way we see the future. I think in terms of the mood, I would say I'm privileged to have the word social impact in my title, but social impact is very much mainstreamed within the organization. It's been cascaded and delegated to a lot of the people working in operations, in legal, in communications in particular, and by extension to the network of colleagues who work in the market. So for us, the mood is cautiously optimistic and bright, I would say. I think we're still looking at it with sort of a positive perspective.
Thanks, Lynn.
I would just say that that's a really important point, that we say, oh, everybody's against ESG, it's anti-woke. But the truth is, in the corporations, the great corporations, the Nestle's, I'm on the board of Estee Lauder, these things are happening. We are making sure our packaging is right. because our customers are demanding it, and like you said, and the film, the employees demand it. So there is leadership, even though there are some random, it's basically random, the attacks on all of this.
Yeah.
And we've got to roll ahead because we are creating long-term shareholder value.
Absolutely.
And that's what our CEOs are confident of.
And I would also say that, the coalition of the willing that I was talking about, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism is part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which Nessa is also an active member of. And I think when we all come together, we talk and we realize that membership for WBCSD and similar entities is actually increasing year on year. It wouldn't be increasing if the mood and the sentiment wasn't positive or up.
I'm just going to stop you there. That is a really, really fascinating shift that's happening in leadership. I mean, arguably in response to lagging growth, that actually you're seeing leadership actually put sustainability at the heart of what is needed to respond to it. Nicoletta, I'd love to bring you in at this point. Do you see, therefore, in light of these sort of trends, do you think that the perceived pushback towards ESG is actually a bad thing? Do you think this is a moment where business leaders could see this as somewhat of an opportunity?
Very interesting reflection there. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here in this really interesting conference. So is it bad? I have spent 31 years in the chemical and materials industry, and so if I put myself for a moment into the shoes of a CEO of a big chemical company, I know I'm leading a transformation that requires my business to decarbonize by -7% every year through 2050. If I wouldn't hear any pushback from my people, I would be really concerned. So pushback comes as a result of action, right? So it would be more concerning to me if there would be no pushback. There are different things that have happened over the past years. So when we think about the Paris Agreement and the years after the Paris Agreement, I think these were years of announcements, of setting targets, of committing. And now it is the time that we actually know what will need to happen. And we know that this transition is not going to be easy. There are still people who are speaking about a soft landing. I don't think this is a good term. This is really a dramatic change. But I also find it really exciting. Intellectually exciting, from a technology perspective exciting, and from a societal perspective exciting. Another thing that has happened is that when we talk about ESG, we went from the voluntary schemes to policy and to compliance. So the voluntary ESG commitments made by many leaders, and definitely good commitments, but they were only something for the leaders, for the marketing department, for the corporate sustainability department. But now we are moving into also compliance areas, and therefore, of course, there is some pushback, but this is also going to be where we bring the laggards along. And then my last point on this is, transparency is not going to go away. Quite the contrary, the whole morning was about technology. We haven't even talked about how technology and AI can help in the sustainability space, can help us with all this data that we need to collect, and so on. Well, there are today already systems, for instance, one is called Climate Trace, that allow us to use satellites to identify the GHG emissions at the emission sources. So even if these companies don't want to disclose, well, we have the technology to actually identify the emission sources from space. So transparency is not going to go away. Pushback is a good thing because it means that we are reacting and we are doing things. And I do think that this pushback can also lead to better approaches and better things.
Thanks, Nicoletta. Sally?
If I may, I just want to contextualize the pushback piece even further because it's a really great point. And I'm going to go a bit systems nerdy on you for a moment, but I promise you it might be worth it. So if you think about where we are right now, our energy system is in transition, our food system is in transition, our economy is in transition. And in any systems transition, you would expect activating and resisting forces. And there's a great saying, it's not mine, and I'm actually not sure where it came from, but I won't lay claim to it. The closer you get to a system shifting, the harder it pushes back. And that's why we're seeing so much resistance right now, because this whole agenda has gone from, oh, it's some crazy people over there in the distant part of the business, to actually it's in the boardroom. And so there are activated and deeply resisting forces that don't want this change to happen. And that's where they're so mobilized. I would say that they're not that random. I think this is very strategic in terms of how they're targeting this. But it actually is a cause for some optimism, because it means we're really, really, really nearly there. And so in the work that I do with boards is I say, hold your nerve, because actually if we can kind of really mobilize the activating force, and if we can indeed engage with some of the resisting forces, then we'll get that final bit of the system tipping. So for me, this is a sign that the energy system is almost there. The food system is, well, it's a little bit behind, but these systems are in transition and they're about to transform, and that's why we're seeing so much pushback.
Who's they? Who is strategically targeting this?
Well, okay, Chatham House, right? So the oil and gas majors are putting a lot of money into anti-ESG resolutions. So I have a friend who works in a very well-known bank in the US. She actually is spending most of her time in court right now dealing with these anti-shareholder resolutions. Track back who's funding them. It's actually sometimes oil and gas money. It can be politically driven. It is organizations that actually don't see themselves in a clean energy transition, and they don't want it to happen. And I could go on, but there are well-funded entities and organizations and individuals. I mean, just look at Elon Musk on whatever, X is it now? I don't know, I've deactivated myself. It's just too much. But there are people that don't want the change. And they are going, didn't I read in the news that he's going to give $1 million a day to voters in Pennsylvania? So that's who I mean.
Yeah. Lynn, you also mentioned in a previous conversation that we were having about the over-commoditization of ESG and perhaps the extent to which business leaders have sort of brought this backlash on themselves.
Yeah, I think that in the euphoria of, oh, we'll have ESG metrics, we'll have ESG champions, that people commoditized ESG. And, you know, Larry Fink is great, and the film showed how Larry Fink said we must take care of the climate. But that was then, and now he's voted against most ESG resolutions that BlackRock have been voting on. And I think he brought it upon himself, because ESG had hundreds of millions of billions of dollars put into those funds. The ESG fund had a 40 basis point premium over the standard S&P fund, but it basically had the same stocks in it. And BlackRock did nothing to do what is necessary with companies, which is to engage, to understand what the plan is. So that created a lot of negativity because it got commoditized. But, okay, we made a mistake that way, but that doesn't wipe out the need for ESG. And maybe we lose, as you sort of alluded to, we lose the term. We don't need the term ESG, but we do need what Pope Francis said, was we have to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And so I'm not worried about the blowback. I agree. On the climate issue, there's a lot of money, vested interest. Look, Donald Trump said, give me $1 billion and you'll get what you want from my government. But I also want to point out that I thought the world was over in the 2016 campaign, literally. I mean, I was ready to put a gun to my head. But look at what happened after that. That letter from the Business Roundtable was 2019.
Yeah.
That was when Donald Trump was president. And on the climate agenda, when Donald Trump was president, and fasten your seatbelts, folks, get ready. You might see this again. I hope I'm wrong. But when that did happen, the mayors got together,
Yep.
the states got together. And so it's like Martin Luther King said, you know, the arc of moral justice is long, but the arc of what was it? The arc of moral history is long, but it bends towards justice. And so I am an optimist, and I think that I do think we're overblowing the negative feedback, because I don't know, companies are doing things like, they're de-emphasizing DEI as a thing, but they're not taking away commitments to a lot of our members, J&J. A lot of people are going to have 30%
Yep.
racial minorities or 30% women.
And that
in the
really
highest.
corroborates.
And that's real. That is
Yeah.
already
I would
incorporated.
agree. I mean,
And it's outside of the comms department. In the good corporations, it's embedded in executive comp. It's embedded in what is told to Wall Street. I look at the questions on the areas that I care about that come in to Estee Lauder, and every analyst call will ask us something, what we're doing on palm oil or what we're doing about promoting women. So I think in the real world, it's better than we think. And I think we should, as Joe Biden says, take the win.
Yeah, and I just would add, so all the US businesses and the multinationals I work with, none of them are dialing back on any of their commitments. The internal work continues. Just right now, ahead of an election, they're not saying much publicly. And what happens with the election will determine whether or not that comes back. But privately, many of them are actually privately lobbying in the Senate with Republican senators to say, if you get into power, please don't scrap the Inflation Reduction Act, because actually it's been an incredible vehicle for job creation. So, you know, I think it is overblown. I think the negative, like you were saying a moment ago, the kind of negative news is just much easier to talk about, and that's why at the very start I try to sort of rebalance, because investors, I couldn't agree more, really, really want this. I work with loads of chief sustainability officers. 3 years ago, they used to say, I never get to talk to investors, and now they're like, oh my God, I'm talking to investors the whole time.
Yeah.
And that's a really important signal.
Yeah, I think the point, Lynn, that you raised around how difficult it's becoming to be transparent on these very discrete issues, because they are becoming embedded, they are becoming integrated into business operations. Zishan, I really want to come back to you, because I promised that we would keep this positive and practical. And I'd love to speak a little bit more about the collective action that Nestlé takes in order to further its social impact.
Absolutely, yeah. That's an integral part of the way we do our advocacy and our partnership building. Collective action just basically refers to what the term stands for. Coming together in conferences and public forums such as this one, engaging with academia, with thought leaders. Just last week with Oxford University's School Center, we launched a report on just transition in regenerative food systems and how to scale those, which we're really happy about. Do take a read. It's great reading, not bedtime reading. So have a look at that. And then besides that, just generally, I think to Nicoletta's point, the point about legislation is quite valid, because what was voluntary 5 years ago is mandatory today.
Yeah.
And it's in the private sector's interest to stay ahead of that curve, because if they stay behind it, there are fines involved, reputational crises involved. It's not in anyone's interest to do that. So my strong recommendation to the private entities in the audience is to think about those considerations, because if you were doing good yesterday, you need to be doing great today and excellent tomorrow.
And just to pick up on both Lynn and Sally's points about working with other stakeholders, so what about your supply chain? What about your investors? How are you bringing those stakeholders on your journey?
Yeah, so for the suppliers, we have this document which we consider as sort of the Bible for our suppliers, and that includes farmers as well as the tier ones. It's called the Nestlé Responsible Sourcing Core Requirements document.
It's great, actually.
Oh my, you've
I
read
have
it?
read it.
Oh my God, wow, okay. Good for you. So yeah, it's a lengthy read. It's deep in terms of the way we approach this whole topic of responsible sourcing, which is really at the core of the work that we do. We have over 500,000 farmers who we source from directly, millions more who work in the value chain. So it's really the bread and butter, pun intended, of how we approach the topic. We work with the suppliers to come up with all of these things. The Income Accelerator program that we have with cocoa farmers in West Africa, a lot of that we co-created with them. We got a lot of feedback from them saying, we don't bank. We don't have bank accounts. How are we going to get paid for all of this? And that's how the mobile money option in that came about. The Income Accelerator program is basically a conditional cash transfer program, and so it was very much co-designed with them. So that's how we work with the suppliers and with the colleagues I mentioned
Amazing.
earlier. Our social impact is very much cascaded within the system. So
Yeah, and obviously your particular circumstances are not replicated necessarily in every corporate. It's really insightful to hear how you manage that. Nicoletta, I'm also conscious that the path to sustainability is not linear, and as you mentioned already, we're seeing pushback now, and hopefully that's an indication of progress. But do you think there's more that business leaders can actually lean into the complexity of it?
Yes, absolutely. I think we still fall into the trap that we try to separate E, S, G, and all of the topics that we have discussed here and that are being discussed currently when we talk about the multi-crisis are so interconnected. And I do think we need as leaders to start embracing this complexity, because it's only by doing so that we can also be one step ahead of the next issue that is going to surface and that we need to consider. Another thing that I think leaders need to do is to expand their circle of concern, their circle of caring. So for me, life cycle assessments that go from my factory to the gate of the customer, it's not good enough when my product ends up in the environment as plastic packaging or whatever. So we need to expand our circle of caring as leaders and also embrace complexity, because that's the reality of today. And again, I find it actually quite fascinating and interesting to not compartmentalize issues, but really to look at them holistically. And that's the only way we can have change emerge in a system, because a system is not something that we control as we are used to control a simple process, but a system is something where we emerge in a different state, and that takes a lot of people to join in.
Thank you so much. We are nearly out of time, and just to close out our panel this afternoon, I would love if each of you could perhaps give one very small piece of advice to a business leader facing this sort of pushback and, perhaps thinking that they'll have to roll back their ESG commitments next year. Nicoletta, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think the crisis that we have is a kind of leadership crisis in the end. Yeah? And every leader needs to ask themselves, what kind of leader do I want to be? Do I want to be the leader that maintains the status quo and actually risks lives? Or do I want to be the leader that advances to a better state? Yeah? So that's a soul searching. So I would ask every leader to do a little bit of soul searching and think about what leader you want to be.
Thank you. Zishan?
I would say courageous leadership is what we're looking for and what we need right now. I think remain firm, steadfast, weather this storm. This is a storm just like any other. Weather the storm, we'll come out better after it.
I'm going to cheat, but I'll be really quick. 2.
Is it 5 points?
Remember the business case. The business case is so irrefutable when it comes to sustainability. I've actually been dusting off old business case slides. I've been reusing them to say, look, there's a business case for this. But the second, on complexity theory, remember there are adjacent possibilities. The future isn't written. What we do today will determine what happens next. And self-fulfilling and self-defeating prophecies are real. So believe that we can do this, and we will.
Thank you, Sally. Lynn?
To thine own self be true.
Oh, what a way to end the panel. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, audience, as well.
Thank you. Thanks.